This conference will now be recorded.
I hope everyone heard that announcement, so you can all be on your best behavior. Frank agreed to letting me record the conference for anybody who's not here that might want to see it. This is Jim, WX3B, for those of you that don't know me. It's nice to see a large crowd assembled for Frank's presentation tonight. I wanted to ask if there are any guests that are attending to have this count as a PVR seating for membership requirements. Could you please tell us who you are so I can make mental note of that? I know there are a lot of guests here, but right now I'm asking for anyone that is interested that was mentioning interest in joining the club and had set up the meeting for purposes of having a membership attendance requirement fulfilled. Is there anybody out there in that category? I was looking specifically for one young person named Ben, but I'll keep an eye out for him. Is there anyone online right now that has a major announcement that just can't wait that you'd like to share with the group before I turn it over to Frank? Okay, that's good. And for those of you that joined that didn't see the announcement beforehand, the primary purpose of tonight is to have Frank Donovan give a little tour of his 60 years of competitive contesting and continuous improvement. I've been fortunate enough myself to have known Frank, I guess, since about 1998. And several years after meeting him as a greenhorn and asking how to join his team and become an operator there, Frank said it's simple, show up at the top of a few single operator contests. Well, that probably wasn't going to happen right away, and I'm glad he invited me to operate with him anyway. Frank has the premier multi station on the East Coast, and very few people have built a station like it or would even attempt it. And this is a great look at Frank's history from the beginning as a young child through now. So Frank, I'm going to make you the presenter, and I'm going to let you tell your story that I enjoyed watching parts of. And now I'm glad I'm going to be able to see the whole thing.
He's still a young child.
Jim, do you have a way to mute everybody so we don't have a lot of noise?
Yes, I will do that. I'm going to mute everyone, and then I believe you can unmute yourselves to ask questions. All right, hold on. Let me see if I can do that. Okay, I did it. Now Frank needs to unmute himself. There you go, Frank. You're unmuted.
Okay.
And you should be the presenter.
Yeah. Now, do you see my screen yet?
There's a screen share icon on the bottom that you have to push the button for.
Yeah, but it doesn't
You may
seem
have to glide.
I see the button. It's not. It's white, which kind of implies that I'm not the presenter.
Okay, hold on a second. Let me try making you the presenter again. Yeah, you're not the. Hold on a second. That's interesting. It's
Jim, sometimes
Tim?
just letting Frank be the organizer is the best way.
Okay, thanks, Tim. We're going to try that next. Okay, Frank, you're now the organizer.
We now see your screen, Frank.
Okay, good. Okay.
Good.
So do you now see a full screen?
Yes.
We can if we want. Yes, I'm good. That's good.
Okay, good. Okay, so this particular photograph is one of my favorite places in the world. Some of you probably know that I have a bunch of second cousins in Ireland, and this photograph was taken maybe about 2 minutes before what looks like a bright, beautiful sunny day turned into a torrential downpour, and that nice meal you see on the table there was dragged indoors. But that kind of stuff happens in Ireland all the time. Okay, so I think a lot of you have been to my station. This photograph was taken 1 week before the tower on the left was toppled by a tornado. And
Jeez.
those of you who have been to my open houses recognize the trees on the left side there that used to line the driveway. The ones on the right were not, well, they were damaged by the tornado. The ones on the left were destroyed. And W3UR's house is just behind the red and white tower, the 40-meter tower, and his house wasn't touched. My house had a couple of torn screens, but the tower, well, that one tower by the house was totally destroyed. And the telephone poles running down Hobbs Road were split. Well, they were snapped right at the base. So it was an interesting day, to say the least. I had just gotten home from a dental appointment minutes before, otherwise I would have been right in the middle of all this. Okay, well, let me just describe the antennas that are here for those who haven't been to the station. Going from the left is the 200-foot 10-meter tower that crashed to the ground. And I was always convinced that if I ever lost one of these towers that I might lose all of them, because the towers are closer together than 200 feet, but miraculously that tower, when it fell, folded into the only available space where it could have fallen without snapping guys on other towers. The tower in the foreground is the 20-meter rotating tower. It's 150 feet tall. The red and white tower is a pair of 3-element 40s, both on rotators, and stacked 6-element 10-meter Yagis. The tower in the center of the photograph in the background is another rotating tower, 150 feet high, with 3 7-element 15-meter Yagis and a 30-meter Yagi. And on the right-hand side, there were 2 towers, one directly in front of the other, so they kind of obscure each other. The tower that's near the small building is a 200-foot tower with 3 20-meter Yagis on it, and the tower that's obscuring that one is another 200-foot tower with 15-meter Yagis on it. And the tower on the far right-hand corner is a 150-foot rotating tower with 8-element 10-meter Yagis and a 6-meter Yagi on the top. So that's pretty much the current setup. The only change from this photograph, other than putting the 10-meter tower back up, and I will be forever grateful to all of those that helped in that project, and to N3RR who donated the new tower. The only significant change beyond that is now there's a 2-element 40-meter Moxon Yagi on that tower in the lower right-hand corner. It's just below the 6-meter beam, and that is a fantastic 40-meter antenna, highly recommended to anyone. Very low VSWR, of course, the whole 40-meter band, and it's just a couple of dB down from the big 3-element Yagis. Okay, so let's step back in time. Sometimes people ask me when I got started in radio, and I have a very consistent answer, and that is 1922. And they always look at me strangely, like, come on, can't be serious. But it's absolutely serious. I grew up in a 3-family home. You'll see a photograph of that home a little bit later, in the city of Providence, in a densely populated urban area. And my grandparents owned that home. It was built by my great-grandfather. And my family lived on the first floor, and my grandparents lived on the 3rd floor. And my grandfather had a really nice workshop in the basement. And I used to spend some time with him in that workshop. And then when I was about 7 years old, we started building 1-tube radios together. A couple of hours once a week that we would do that together. And my grandfather got started in radio when he was 20 years old, in 1922. He started building 1-tube radios when AM broadcasting came to Providence, Rhode Island. And he started building them for his friends and relatives also. So he built quite a few one-tube radios, strictly for the AM band, so they could listen to the new broadcast stations. And he had lots of parts that he had accumulated when he was doing that. He stopped doing that a few years later, but miraculously he saved all these parts. And when I was 7 years old, he dragged a bunch of those parts out from the closet. And the only thing that, all of his knowledge, everything he ever knew about radio, he learned in 1922 to about 1924, 1925. And then he got involved in other things and never came back to radio. So all of his knowledge was from that period. All of the components were from that period, with the sole exception of the batteries that we needed to operate these radios. So it literally is true that I began in radio in 1922. And this is a typical diagram of a one-tube radio regenerative receiver of that era at the bottom. And then at the top, since we lived in the city and the radio stations weren't far away, a simple 1N34 rectifier and a piece of wire and a pair of headphones, and you could hear all the stations in the city all at once. And you could put a little bit of a tuner in the front of it and try to get a little more signal strength out of one of them. So that was how I started. A few years later, my parents bought me an S38D, Holocrafters 5-tube AC/DC radio. It was very popular at the time. And I started listening for AM broadcast stations. And the way you went about getting cards was with a postcard, which I think the postage was about 2 cents at the time. And I just used the plain postcards from the post office and created my own QSL cards with a pen and ink. And these are some of the shortwave stations that were quite active at the time. And what you would discover if you were a shortwave listener at that time is you would soon discover the ham bands. Most of the hams were still on AM back then. The vast majority were on AM. And there were two DXers in town. Their photographs are at the bottom. W3LPL, who was a very keen 10-meter DXer. He had a 3-element Yagi on the roof of his 3-story home, and it was turned by a steering wheel on the ceiling of his shack that went to a mast that penetrated the roof up to the 3-element Yagi. He ran about 500 watts. He had a very old 1930s era Holocrafters receiver. And one of the other hams that I got to know was another DXer, W1WKO, who had more modern equipment, but he didn't hold a candle to W1HJB, because Al W1HJB was always on 10 meters if it was open. And of course, this was during the peak of the biggest sunspot cycle of the radio era. So 10 meters was hot as a firecracker. And I went off and bought a call book around this time, 1957, 58, and discovered where all these hams lived. And I would go on my bicycle and go visit them. And some of them were very friendly and some less so. So how did you go about getting involved in ham radio? So the hams that I got to know encouraged me to get my license. And the way you went about doing that was not by getting on the World Wide Web and looking for information. You had to use mail order and buy the things you needed. So the things you bought to become a ham was the Amico code course. And you could get that on a 78 RPM record, which is what I bought, or 45 RPM, and then in order to try to learn how to send, you could buy a code practice oscillator, but the most popular and least expensive way was to buy this buzzer from E.F. Johnson, which made sort of a crude CW note, and off you went. So I made a lot of progress with that, but getting licensed was still kind of an enigma. But there was, in Popular Electronics magazine in the 50s and into the 60s, there was a very popular column by Herb Breyer, W9EGQ. It was called The Novice Shack. And if you look in this November 1958 issue of Popular Electronics, and it's on the web, you will find in his column was a request by me for help in getting my novice license. And when that was published in November 1958, I got several phone calls from neighborhood hams, and one of them, W1WJY, who was probably about 70 years old at the time, took me under his wing, and he very quickly discovered that my code speed was better than his. So we focused on things that I hadn't done, which was learning to send a little bit better. So he did that, and then learning the multiple choice questions that would appear on the novice exam. So after a few months of spending time with him, he suggested that the time had come to get my license, and he recommended that I join a local radio club, the Providence Radio Association. And I did. I'll go to this slide in just a minute. So he introduced me to another neighborhood ham, W1VAY, Walt, and Walt took me to the Providence Radio Association club meeting, and that's kind of one of those major pivot points in life when I went to that meeting. Got to know a whole lot of hams, and some of those hams I still know very well today. And took my novice license exam there in May of 1959, because everything was done by mail. There was a lot of formality. In order to take the written exam, it was sealed in a sealed envelope, and when you opened that and took the exam, it had to be resealed, and a notary public had to affirm that you were the person who signed the thing, and off it went in the mail. And so field day came along in 1959, and I still didn't have my license, but that didn't stop me. So at this point, I was 12 years old, and the Providence Radio Association set up this field day operation. They were a very keen field day group. A lot of the organization of the club was focused on this big activity every year, and for them it still is. So this was a big eye-opener for me. Now, I think in our current society, for a family to send a 12-year-old boy off for the weekend with a bunch of men that they had never met would be unacceptable. But in the 50s, it was okay. And they literally dropped me off at this field day site on Saturday morning and picked me up on Sunday afternoon, and all was well. I'm going to give a test at the end so you guys could pronounce the name of this hill. And you can see the name right there on the upper left-hand corner in that cartoon, W1OP, and then the name of the hill. And in the upper right-hand corner is a cartoon that appeared in QST a couple of years later where it said, "I said, hill, don't you understand English?" And then the other comment about Gansett, well, that's Narragansett Lager beer, which was a very popular beer in Providence at the time. So there'll be a test at the end to see who can figure out how to pronounce the name of that place. So this field day, the CW guys were in this tent. This was an Army cook's tent, probably from the 1940s. And inside that tent was a National NC300 and a Viking 2. That was the CW station. And some very proficient CW operators. And then the other station was this brand new Collins KWM1 in the lower left-hand corner. That was the predecessor to the more popular KWM2, a very proficient, very excellent single sideband transceiver. The KWM1 covered only 20, 15, and 10 meters. And these guys that were operating this KWM1 on single sideband were working the world with a 2-element quad. It was really quite amazing to watch. And it seemed like this was a huge score, and they were all very proud of it, but 404 QSOs is what you see at the top of the screen, which today is sort of ho-hum, but back in the 1950s, that was quite an accomplishment. And this is the Providence Radio Association today. the same building where I took my novice exam. They acquired this huge log periodic. It wasn't there when I was a member. It was installed in 1983. But this will give you an idea as to what a kind of a good location that was. This photograph was taken from a quadcopter, and you can see the city of Providence right in front of this antenna, 200 feet below. It's quite a fantastic location. And I spent quite a bit of time operating from the club with a much simpler antenna than this log periodic, but nonetheless, the location was incredible. And this is the home where I was raised in Providence. It was on about a tenth of an acre. I remember the size of the lot was 80 by 80. And we were very fortunate because when my great-grandfather built this house, he also bought the empty lot to the right. Normally in the city, you can see that there was a house very close to the left of this house. And normally there would have been another house immediately to the right. But he had acquired an empty lot, and that was a big part of my success. I remember the diagonal measure across this entire lot very well, the two lots. It was 111 feet diagonally from corner to corner. And of course, I was first licensed as KN1LPL, and then went to Boston and took my general class license exam in around February 1960 and lost the N. And this is my first station. These are not the exact pieces of equipment that I owned. In fact, this isn't quite the first station. The receiver in the lower left-hand corner replaced the Holocrafters S38 that I used for the first 6 months as a ham. And I don't know how many of you have ever tried to use a Holocrafters S38D receiver, but they're very crude receivers, no selectivity, very poor resistance to overload by strong signals. So with the S38D, I was pretty much confined to daytime operation because the receiver was hopelessly overloaded by strong signals and by broadcast stations. But so I started on 80 meters operating in the day, and at that time, the novice band was a fair amount of activity during the day on 80, and they would all be school kids. Most of the new hams in that period were school kids, so quite a few of the hams that I met on 80 meter CW in those days were kids who were my age or a little bit older. And my transmitter was one that I built when I was 11 years old. It was an Amico AC1 single tube transmitter, single tube plus rectifier, and started on 80. And around Thanksgiving of 1959, before I got my general class license, some of the club members encouraged me to put up a dipole for 40 meters. So over the Thanksgiving holiday weekend, my grandfather and I installed a 40-meter dipole, and I was off to the races with a new band. And during the day, the S38 was okay, but the AM broadcast stations totally destroyed the band, especially for an S38 receiver. So Christmas 1959, the receiver in this photograph, it's a Holocrafters S108, showed up under the Christmas tree, and that was a vast improvement over the S38D. And within a week after this, and I was still a novice, I worked my first DX QSO, which was a station in the Canal Zone, KZ5MQN. And during that period, if you were a novice in the Canal Zone, the N went at the end of the call. You obviously couldn't change the KZ5 to a KN5, so KZ5MQN was my first DX contact. So my first contest was the 1960 Novice Roundup. So I still hadn't got my general class license in the mail yet. I had to wait for 6 or 8 weeks for that. And I thought I did pretty well in 33 hours of operation. At that time, the Novice Roundup ran continuously for 15 days, 24 hours a day, 15 days. And in 33 hours of operation with this Amico AC1 and the receiver you see in the photograph, I made 48 QSOs. Quite an accomplishment, I thought, until I saw the results, and another ham had made 3 times as many. But I was happy with the result. So my first contest after being licensed as a general class licensee was the CD party. And the nearest thing to that in today's contesting world is the North American QSO party. And in fact, the NAQP replaced the July CD party. The CD parties were held 4 times a year, January, April, July, and October. And I got in that contest for 2 hours and made 19 QSOs. But 2 of them were with people I know very well. N3RS is the current call sign of W3WJD, and he was my first QSO, that's SIG, W3WJD, and one day I'll replace this QSL with the W3WJD card. And shortly after making my first contest QSO as a general class with SIG, shortly after that I worked the station at Johns Hopkins University. And the operator there may have been Roll K3RA. But in any case, if it wasn't Roll, it was another one of the other well-known hams of that period. So the only thing that changed in my station when I got licensed as a general class is my Amico AC1 got replaced by a Harvey Wells TBS 50, which was a late 1940s transmitter. And it was a decent transmitter, had a VFO, which was a big improvement, but it had terrible chirp. So I was always being bugged on the air about the chirp problem that I had, but that didn't stop me. So my first sweepstakes was that year, and I was getting more competent as a CW operator, and managed to finish 3rd in Rhode Island with 225 QSOs. Now back then, sweepstakes was 2 weekends. It was 33 hours on each weekend, and you could operate a total, so it was a total of 66 hours, and you were allowed to operate a total of 40 hours. So I managed to work 225 QSOs in 38 hours, so that's a little bit better than 5 QSOs per hour. Pretty good, I thought, but then the results came in, and this time I finished 3rd instead of 2nd. And some of the QSLs you see here are hams that I worked in that sweepstakes. And of course, many people recognize W3GRF as PVRC's club call. Lenny, W3GRF, donated to me the first tower I ever owned. And some of the other calls that some might recognize, Vic Clark, W4KFC. W3BES was one of the really famous FRC contesters in that period, and K1HTV is a very active member of PVRC today. So those are some of the hams active back then. Most of these folks are silent keys, I'm afraid. I don't know who the operator was at W9YT, but K3ZO was there is a name on that card, I can't read it. K3ZO was there a little bit after this, I believe. And of course, we had no computers back in those days, so this is how you duped, how you manage dupes in contests. This is not one of mine. This came from the web where somebody had posted it. But this was ARRL operating aid number 6. And in 1960, you couldn't go to their website and download this thing, so you wrote a letter to the league and asked that they send one or more of these, and they would mail them to you. And this was on your desk, and of course, once you got any competence in contesting, you knew that you always kept a pencil in your hand. You never took it out of your hand. You sent with it in your hand. And you logged every QSO in your log and on this operating aid number 6. And if it was a big contest, it kind of overflowed, which this one obviously did. So a couple of years later, 1962, I managed to win my first contest. And some of the guys that operate at my station have seen this plaque. And I won this in kind of a devious way. back in that period in the 1960s, 10 meters was very, very popular for local nets. Kind of the way 2 meters got to be a little later. So there were lots of nets in New England that were active every night. So what I decided to do before this contest was to map out where all these nets were, to check into all of them at least once so they knew who I was. And during this New England QSO party, I checked into those nets on 10 meters and worked dozens of QSOs that nobody else worked. The New England QSO party at that time was a New England only event. So it was New Englanders working New Englanders. And by then, my station had been upgraded. I had built a 150 watt amplifier from parts from an old Arc 5 military transmitter. And I had acquired what is referred to as the coffin bug. So it was a Japanese-made bug that was sold by Radio Shack and Lafayette Radio and other places. So that was my station 2 years later. A little bit better than what I had in 1960. My skills were a lot better, though. And my deviousness had improved. So just like it is today, making a 100,000 point score in sweepstakes is kind of a milestone in contesting success. It was then, and it still is today. Back then, sweepstakes was still 2 weekends, 66 hours of available time. You could only operate 40. And I did operate 40 hours in that one and made 720 QSOs. So that was a big improvement over what I had been doing. And the station was basically the same, except by then I had built an electronic keyer. And this paddle you see here is a W3LPL paddle. And I still have this paddle. And some of you have seen it around the ham shack. And some of you have used it. It's an excellent paddle, not iambic. So along comes the 1964 ARRL CW DX contest. And I wasn't much of a DX contest operator. I did a lot of DXing. Of course, I was a domestic contester, sweepstakes and CD parties almost exclusively. This thing comes along. I am 17 years old in high school. And this is a 2 weekend contest, 48 hours. Is there
This
something
conference will now be recorded.
Okay. So this sweepstakes, this DX contest comes along, and I operated 40 hours over 2 weekends, but mostly DXing, not running. My station was still 150 watts, and I was using mostly wire antennas up in trees. Nothing fancy, just dipoles. And these are some of the stations that I worked. Pretty good stuff. And it was very enjoyable, and I submitted the score, and big surprise. This effort was the first place USA score in the low power category in the ARRL DX contest in 1964. But then off to college, and my contesting activity declined a lot for the next 4 years. Let's take a look at this contest. In 1964, the ARRL CW DX contest, not the phone contest, the CW contest only, had something called quotas. You're only allowed to work a total of 6 QSOs in any single country. So this really, really discouraged running on CW because you would quickly run out of Gs that you could work, and I'm sure it wouldn't have been very easy to turn to one of the other Gs. So, but this was a part of contesting back until 1966. So, my final year of college, and immediately after graduation, we set up this field day operation. It's the same tent as the one that the W3LPL group used in 1959, but we had a much better site. If you look in the photograph there, you can see some very, very tall telephone poles. The telephone poles were about 40 feet high, and then there are, probably 6 by 6 or 8 by 8 timbers that ran up above the pole another 20 feet. So these poles were at least 60 feet high, maybe a little higher at the top. And this field was full of them. And why was that? Well, and this would prove to be kind of a fateful thing for my career to be. This was a signals intelligence collection and direction finding site operated by the Federal Communications Commission during World War II in their radio intelligence division. They had a couple of hundred acres here in Rhode Island on a nice hilltop, very rural at the time, still pretty rural in 1968. And they had installed Robic antennas all over this site. And these were the World War II era telephone poles that the FCC installed on the site. And the stations that we used, two of them are shown here. One was on the right-hand side was a NC303 and a Holocrafters HT32. And on the left was a Collins S line that I bought for myself as my college graduation present, and 7584 that I had bought a few years before. And we had a few other stations. I don't remember what they were, but this was a very successful field day. And my last contest I ever operated in New England. And yes, field day is a contest, even though the WRL insists it's not. So W3LPL, for the one and only time, finished first place in their category, 4 transmitters. And my main partner in this effort was my best friend in college, K1JYN, who is now well known to all contesters as K6LL in Arizona. And we made just a little bit more than 2,000 QSOs, which was a big deal, and we finished first in our category. So shortly after that field day, a couple of things happened. Number one, that site was owned by the state of Rhode Island, and they auctioned it off. So that site was no longer available for field day. And second, my draft notice arrived. So by July of 1969, I was a brand new minted second lieutenant in the Air Force, and we moved to Maryland. And an interesting thing happened. I set up a ham station in the multifamily housing that was assigned to me on Fort Meade. And I set up the Collins S line you see here in the photograph in the housing unit we had. And I set up some wire antennas out behind the unit and started contesting, of course. And after a couple of contests, I got a letter delivered to me in person by the executive officer for the base commander. And I had to sign the letter that I had received it. And that letter ordered me to immediately cease and desist all ham radio operations from Fort Meade and to appear at an in-person meeting with him about a week later. Oh boy. So that was the end of my contesting. I did not get in the ARRL DX contest in 1970 because of that letter. Actually, 1970. So I went to meet the base commander, and he reiterated that I was prohibited from any ham radio operation on the base. And I asked him, I said, one of the reasons I'm operating on the base is because as a second lieutenant, if housing is available on the base, I'm required to stay on the base. And I asked him if there's any possibility that I could be exempted from that requirement to live on the base. And he said, I'll be happy to exempt you from that. It'll save me a lot of headaches. So he wrote up an order that exempted me from the requirement to stay on the base. And Phyllis and I went off and found a home on 3/4 of an acre of land about 10 miles from Fort Meade. And the first operation from that home shortly after we moved in was field day of 1970. And in this photograph, which I assure you was totally fake, totally made up, staged, you can be sure that my wife on the left side had nothing to do with fueling our generator. And on the right is Jackie, the wife of K6LL. But we did use this generator, but they didn't fuel it. In fact, Phyllis's hand, it looks like, is right on the spark plug. But Dave and I were in the 2B category and made almost 2,400 QSOs. We ran kilowatt power just to make it a little bit more fun. And so that was the first contest from Maryland. Other than those CQ Worldwides that got me invited to leave Fort Meade. So this slide's out of sequence. So this is the station I used on Fort Meade that earned me that letter from the base commander. So I managed to make 100,000 points in the sideband sweepstakes in 1969 with this S-line, and this kilowatt amplifier I purchased from my boss. When I took my assignment at Fort Meade, little did I know, but my boss turned out to be a PVRC member, W3GN, and I purchased this amplifier, a kilowatt pair of 813s from Larry. And there's a QSL card from not from my Fort Meade location, but from the first location after I was invited to leave the post. So lots of changes started happening after that. By the time 1974 came along, I was very much into DX contesting. I had already installed a 130-foot tower that had been given to me by Lenny, W3GRF. And I have figured out by this time I owned a pair of S-lines, and I figured out that if I installed them side by side, I could operate in this style of operating called SO2R, which, as far as I knew, no one else was doing at the time. The style of SO2Rs was a lot different than what is done today. What I was doing was running on one S-line and using the second S-line to hunt for multipliers. And when I was in college, I built my first 3-1000Z amplifier. And this photograph is not the amplifier I used in 1974. It's one of the amplifiers I use today, I think. This is probably the 80-meter amplifier that I use today. So, of course, I got very interested in multi-multi contesting a few years later. And these are some of the hams that were active in multi-multi contesting when I started. Most of these hams are silent keys today. W4BVV in the upper right-hand corner also worked in the same building where I worked. His office was directly below mine, and he was a very, very successful PVRC multi-multi station back in the 70s. And Tom, who I saw very frequently, encouraged me to not only try to achieve a #1 position in PVRC as a single op, but then a few years later encouraged me to try multi-multi also, and I did. And this was our first effort as a multi-multi contest entry in 1977. And you can see the top 10 scores right there in the center. My multi-multi mentor at W4BVV was ahead of me by a good amount, as was W3AU. And during this period, back in the 70s, stations on the West Coast were very competitive, and W7RM in Washington, who's also a PVRC member, he lived in the DC area all during the period of World War II and the early 50s. It was very difficult to beat him. It was a fantastic station in Washington, and there's so much JA activity that it was pretty tough to beat. So I was really pleased at our first effort. We managed to finish in 8th place. But then a very big surprise happened. Just 4 years later, in the 1982 contest. By then, I had put up a second tower, and I had installed a 6-element 10-meter Yagi up above my 3-element 40-meter beam. So that antenna was about 140 feet high. And 1982 was one of the peak years of the sunspot cycle back then. And something amazing happened. On both Friday night and Saturday night, there were huge openings to Japan. And at the time, as I do today, in our multi operations, we had 2 transmitters on each band sharing a common amp. And I remember listening to the 10-meter operator on the second receiver. And for quite a long time on both Friday and Saturday night, when I was listening around on 10 meters, the only DX stations I could hear on the band were JAs that were calling us in the pileup. And other than that, the band was dead. And in that contest, we worked more JAs than any other station in the United States, West Coast or East Coast. And our score was modest on the other bands, but it was incredible on 10 meters, and we wound up winning this contest. The first one we won, and I never expected to win one this early. So that kind of wet my whistle, and I decided, if we wanted to do this multi thing in a serious way, I needed a better location, because I had acquired another empty lot, but I still had less than 2 acres, and I wasn't going to be able to consistently finish near the top by depending on luck. So it's something had to be done. And this was a photograph of one of the last contests that we did from my old QTH. So this is what contest stations looked like indoors in those days. My trusty Collins S line there in the middle. That was a TS-830 on the left, operator K3RV. And on the right is a Drake's C line on 160 meters. That's how you did it back in that period. No computers, you see, absolutely no trace of any computers, just paper, operating aids, and paper logs. So Phyllis and I went out and looked for new property back in 84 and 85, and in April of 85, we purchased a piece of property here in Glenwood. And the rules in Howard County were very favorable for hams. There were no height limits, and in the written zoning regulations, no limits on the number of towers. And I went off and hired a lawyer and made sure there were no issues, and he said, no problems at all. So I decided to go ahead and apply for a building permit for 7 towers. Just go ahead and apply for the permit for the whole thing. So I submitted the building permit application, and a week later I got a letter in the mail saying, sorry, Howard County does not allow what you are proposing to build. We cannot issue a building permit for 7 towers in this county. Oh boy. I had already contracted to have a house built, and it was just about ready to get underway. In fact, it was underway. So this wasn't good. But turns out in 1985, the county executive in Howard County was an active ham. He was a member of the Columbia Amateur Radio Association. I did not know him, but I knew some of the CARA members who knew him. So I got introduced to him through CARA and got his phone number, and the other person made arrangements for me to have a contact with him, a conversation with him on the phone at his home. And I called him and told him what happened, and he said, well, let me see what I can do. And I've never had any further contact with him after that, but a week later, this building permit arrived in the mail. I have no idea what happened as a result of that telephone call. Never had any discussions, but I was very happy to have this building permit arrive. And very soon after this arrived, construction of the towers was underway. But it wasn't the end of the problems. This article appeared in the Howard County Times around January of 1986. And you can see my house under construction there. and an AB 105 tower that was just temporarily guyed. This, in fact, is the tower that fell over in the tornado. And then the way this photograph was taken, it looks like a monstrous tower, but in fact, it's the first 20 feet of what would become a 200-foot tower. And one of my neighbors didn't quite see things the way I did. And he wrote a letter to the same Howard County executive that somehow managed to get my building permit approved. And I don't know if this is common, but the public correspondence file of the Howard County executive was open to the press. And the press discovered this letter from the neighbor and thought it would make an interesting story, and it was. And this letter is very well written, it's very balanced. So that neighbor still owns a home here, same home that they had just purchased in 1985, and hasn't spoken a word to me since that day that he came over to take a look at these towers. So this is what stations looked like in 1995. By then, computers were very much part of the operation. K1EA developed the CT contest program, and it came into pretty widespread use by the late 80s. So these are 386 computers probably, and monochrome monitors. So that's how we did things back then. And this is probably a TS950 on the left and a TS850 on the right. And the amplifier was a single 3-1000. So this is what the station looked like in 1995. The trees hadn't grown very much by then. The towers are pretty much the way they are now, except that that tower in the center of the photograph fell down 4 years ago and got replaced, but pretty much looks the same. So one of the things I was able to do shortly after building my station was get access to a 4-acre field. That's about 1,000 feet southeast of my home. And this was the configuration of beverages that we had starting in the mid-90s. So there were 8 beverages all around the compass, and you can see they overlap, and beverages are very handy. It's very easy to overlap them this way. As long as you separate them by a couple of feet from each other, they seem to be completely happy. And one of the very difficult things to do in multi contesting has only been achieved in the United States by 3 stations. First, by the K2GL contest station, which always used the N2AA call sign. They won all 4 contests in a single season in 1982. And then in the late 80s and early 90s, my station managed to do that 4 times. We've never done it again. We've won it 3 times, but never 4 after 1994. And then over the last 10 years, the K3L, our station, managed to do it 3 times. So it's never been achieved since 2014. K3LR and W3LPL have split these contests ever since, with Tim winning most of the phone contests and us winning most of the CW contests. And this was a cover photograph on CQ. The station's pretty much laid out the way you see in this photograph, except all of the monitors now are flat screen monitors, no more of the big old CRTs any longer. This happens to be the 160 station where I'm sitting. And the current configuration of receiving antennas for the last 7 years is these 8-circle arrays of short verticals. The verticals are 24 feet tall. The 160-meter verticals in this sketch are in a circle that's 350 feet in diameter. And the 24-foot verticals that comprise the 80-meter 8-circle array are concentric inside the 160 array. Those 2 arrays do not interfere with each other at all. And we also have 3 beverages, I'm sorry, and they run right through the middle of this receiving array, and there's not the slightest bit of trouble. So we have In addition to the 8 directions from these 2 arrays, we also have a northeast beverage, a south beverage, and a west beverage. And it's very handy to have both types of antennas. As many people have heard me say, you can never have too many antennas, but there's a very important corollary to that, and that is unless they interfere with each other. And it's very difficult to prevent multiple antennas from interfering with each other. It's more common than most people think. And this is a photograph taken in the snow from the top of my 200-foot, 40-meter tower, looking over towards the receiving arrays. So those receiving arrays are about 1,200 feet away, and the tower in the foreground is a 20-meter rotating tower, although the only beam you can see in this photograph clearly is a little 12-meter Yagi. So if you look at this photograph, you can see the little short posts that support the beverage antennas, and the taller posts are the 24-foot verticals in the 160-meter 8-circle array. And in 2013, I think, I only had the 160 8-circle, not the 80-meter one yet. And this is the tornado that toppled the 200-foot tower. A few days, well, it was the next weekend after the tornado was field day, and we went off and operated field day. And then the weekend after that, a group of about a dozen hams came over, and we disassembled this tower completely in one day. And a few days later, I hauled all the trash off to the dump. 6 weeks after the tornado, the new tower was in place and ready for a new antenna. And this is the building permit for the new tower that replaced the tornado damaged one. The county made it very, very easy to get building permits after that tornado, so there was no issue getting this permit. And there's me up on top of tower after completion. I don't think this is the 10-meter tower. I think this was me working on W3KX's tower, I believe. And this is the last slide. You know, a lot of us get in this hobby thinking ham radio is kind of a solitary sport, but a lot of us who get involved in radio clubs and contesting discover it's far from it. And these are some of the many hams that have helped me over a period of lots of years in my quest from a young 12-year-old novice to where I am today. W1AWE was one of the very first hams that I ever met. He was licensed, and he was a DXer in the 1920s, and Norman always sent his call sign in a very distinctive way. He was a CW operator, so he always sent his call as W1AW and then a space E, and it was very unique. So that's it, Jim. That's the end. That's my last slide. Okay, WX3B, are you there? I guess not.
I am here. I'm having a little audio problem. I don't know whether it is affecting my transmit audio. Does anybody hear me?
Yes, Jim, your audio is fine.
Okay, good. It's only a receive problem. Well, at this point in time, if anybody has a question for Frank, I would invite you to unmute yourself and ask away.
Jim, this is Zori, and if I may direct a comment to Frank and thank him for sharing a beautiful 60 years, starting with a brand new military second lieutenant. I was delighted to have the opportunity one day when I surprised you and walked up behind your house and showed up ready to operate W1AW/3, and you said, "Who are you? What are you doing?" Thank you for taking me under your wing. I was delighted that I had an opportunity to help you with rebuilding the tower. My question is, did you ever replace those boots that were coming apart?
Yes, I did. I think those boots fell apart before the tower was done.
I think they were coming apart one day when you were coming down off the tower.
You'll be happy to know that I did replace them. And the other, more importantly, you'll be happy to know that I no longer free climb. So I have replaced my climbing gear, and now I'm 100% attached.
Glad to hear it.
So WX3B, are you there?
Are there any other? Yeah. Are there any other questions for Frank? Okay. By the way, Frank, I may ask you to close out this meeting because I can barely hear the other people, and I think it's a problem that I might be having here.
Unknown.
But I want to thank you for your presentation, which I've now watched twice.
Oh, here you
Frank, thank you. That was an excellent, excellent demonstration, and what a terrific history of a ham.
And hopefully a lot more years to come.
go. Radio. Oh, I don't know.
Yes.
An interface. I don't know what you call it. Oh, gosh, this. Huh?
Okay, Jim.
Oh.
So I don't know if there are any further questions. I'll be happy to address any more.
Frank, Jerry, AB306.
Hi, Jerry.
Yeah, one thing I'm curious about is those look like a very attractive target for lightning activity. I remember I spoke with you once before. You said your primary protection method was disconnecting from all your equipment during threat times, but have you suffered any lightning damage to the arrays or feed lines themselves?
The rotators are the most susceptible to anything. So occasionally I'll have to replace rotators. And one year, Tom, K3AJ, helped me replace, I guess, 3 of the rotators that had gotten damaged. So that's the biggest problem. And then probably the number 2 after that are the stack match switches on the towers. They're very, very susceptible. In the ham shack, I've had very little damage. And my strategy in the ham shack, there's so much electronics in that ham shack, is that everything is completely disconnected from the feed lines unless they are in use during lightning season. So during the winter, everything is connected. The station is still connected just as it was in the CQ Worldwide CWDX contest in November. But if there's any lightning threat, everything gets completely disconnected from all the control lines and all the coax cables outdoors. And then once the ARRL sideband contest in March is complete, all of the cables in the shack will be disconnected from the antennas and will never be connected to the antennas unless they're in use. And that strategy has worked very, very well for me. And there are other strategies you can employ, but for me, that strategy has worked very well, except for the rotators, the control boxes outdoors.
All right, thank you.
Oh, and by the way, one of the very handy tools to monitor lightning activity is I think it's lightning.org. I don't actually remember the name of it, but there's a website, and you can also put it
Maps.
on a smartphone. Lightning Maps, yes, Lightning Maps. And you can program that for alarms, and you can track the progress of thunderstorms. It's excellent. And my strategy is, if there's lightning activity within 50 miles, everything is disconnected. I don't take any chances, because even if a storm is 30 miles away, you can get a freak lightning strike, even though the storm is far away.
Frank,
Yeah.
I have a question. My name is Brad, V3MXJ. I guess I'm kind of a DX since I'm up in Thunder Bay, Ontario. My question is more of an operating question. I'm a fairly new contester. So the question is, when you're search and pouncing and you're listening to a guy who's running, and as you're turning the dial, all of a sudden, okay, you hear you'll hear the exchange, and then the guy calls Q or Z right away. And a lot of times you got to listen and listen and listen before he gives his call after 3 or 4 QSOs, because all he's saying is Q or Z to make it quicker. Now I kind of get it because I did some running this last contest on the weekend, and yeah, it's a little quicker. But I tried to make an effort at least every second or third QSO to just give my call sign V3MXJ Q or Z so people could hear it. Do you have any thoughts, any strategies, or any strategy, whatever, for, or did I confuse you, or do you know what I mean?
No, I think anybody who operates any phone contest especially is familiar with stations not giving their call, or when they do give it, to give it in a way that's perhaps difficult to understand. Um, from my station, we can usually get through a pileup pretty quick. So we usually don't wait. So the strategy we usually follow, rather than waiting, is if a station is not giving their call, we will call them, but we will refuse to give them our report until they tell us what their call sign is. So that strategy works. So for example, in your case, if you come across a station working a pileup, just go ahead and call them. And then when it's your turn to give them a report, don't give them a report. Give him your call sign and ask for his call sign. And then when he's given you his call sign, then give the report.
Will you always give your call sign for every sideband QSO? Like, will you say your call sign Q or Z, or?
It depends. No, the answer is no. We don't always do it, but in the United States, it's not favorable really to go more than 1 or 2 QSOs without giving your own call. But for de-expeditions where they have these massive pileups, it's pretty common for stations to go 3, 4, 5 QSOs without giving their call. And some of the contests, the CQ Worldwide contest has a rule. I don't remember what it is, but they require that the call sign be given frequently. Is it 3 QSOs?
Yeah, once every 3 QSOs.
And commonly violated. And ARRL has no such rule. But by the way, that's an operating tactic that we follow all the time. If anyone ever tries to work us, and if I don't have their report or I don't have their call sign, I will not complete the QSO until I get their information. Because if I send my exchange and I still don't have that call sign, I might wind up waiting for 10 minutes before I ever get their call sign correct.
Well, and the other thing is, I think I'd like to hear consistency, because then again, I'm just a novice, but I mean, you get to hear a person's pattern, and if one time he says his call sign to Q or Z, then another time he's saying CQ, Q or Z, my call sign. If he's all over the place, you're waiting for that right time to hit the PTT to get in there. So, but I guess that just comes with experience and time.
Yeah, well, I think most of the experienced contesters follow a very predictable pattern, but certainly there are exceptions.
Okay, thank you very much, Frank.
Okay, and welcome to our group.
Thank you. I did meet you once years ago, 2013 at CTU. I was with Tom, V3CX, Tom Avisto.
Yep. Well, hopefully we'll get a chance to do that again.
Yes,
But
let's hope so. Thank
in the meantime, this looks like the CTUs are going to continue online. Everyone knows, I think there's no Dayton this year. I think CTU is going to come off. And there's a focused CTU session this weekend focused on propagation. It's going to happen on Saturday. So CTU is alive, even if Dayton is not.
you. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. If no other questions, I'll turn it back to Jim.
Okay,
I'm
Jim
turning it
has,
over to Tom.
Yeah, I think Jim has some unreliable internet situation, so he asked me to close it out. But so we'll do that now. Thank you very much, Frank. I can attest that there's as much maintenance involved in your station as there is in operating it. The one thing I'd like to remind everybody is PVRC will be hosting a virtual galactic get-together on February 6th at 1 p.m. Vice President Mike Bartz put a notice out on that. Since we can't get together this year at FrostFest, as we've been doing for a while, we're going to go virtual, and there should be some presentations and some interesting things to see. So with that, Jim, I'm going to close it out. Thank everybody for coming. It was a huge turnout, and I'll leave it to you, Jim, or Tim, to shut the thing down. Good evening, everybody.
Thank you. Good evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Nice to see everybody.
Thanks, Frank.
Thanks again, Frank.